legislation. And I think that if you, I think there's a huge increase and maturity around that over the last 10 years. I mean, I think that there's still more work that needs to be done, but I think that we're better off from 98.
Except for the utility sectors, because SCADA and DCS is just an abomination.
Not skater.
Well, it's funny. I mean, it's been making the news recently, and this was something that the L0pht had an article that was in the New York Times around the time that we had testified to the Senate that we could shut the internet down in 30 minutes. And I said, I can get into the the plant control and plant information networks of 30 utility grids that actually have nuclear generators on them.
Yeah, like core goes up, core goes down.
Nobody cared.
Core goes up.
And so now we're it's finally coming up there, but we've moved from these dedicated systems to Microsoft boxes talking Modbus and L0pht on their serial networks, and the stacks alone won't for these systems won't stand up to like an Nmap scan.
But we're spending billions of dollars and maybe tens of billions of dollars in certainly the corporate community, corporate world on security, methodologies, on products, on consultants. You're kind of saying, it sounds like you're kind of saying that at least in some sectors of the economy it's irrelevant, or it hasn't made a bit of difference.
Yeah, out of sight, out of mind.
Anybody else?
Well, you look at the banking industry, right? And I see a lot of things that before I was with L0pht, the banking industry was in one state, and I think definitely the maturity has risen, in that you don't have to prove that a buffer overflow is a dangerous thing anymore.
Good point.
Now it's more like quality assurance. It's like you have to go and clean everything up. We just want a laundry list of everything that's out there, and we believe it. So the maturity has definitely gone up, but then by the same token, now they want to push out new stuff like mobile banking. So you've got all these new territories that are just as bad as the old one used to be, and maybe they've cleaned up a little bit on the back end, in the case of finance, for instance. But
Yeah.
So at least in some places the money's paying off.
NASDAQ's
in
backup
one
is
area,
still,
but they'll grow a new area that it's just weak.
but they're still missing certain things like NASDAQ in New York. Their backup site is within 15 miles.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Which is just ridiculous if you're talking about a natural catastrophe or a targeted, hit.
So we got vulnerabilities all over the place, even now. But you guys, spent really almost a full decade during the '90s trying to address these, call attention to vulnerabilities, things like that. I mean, did the way that you go about it, did it help? Is it, can you look at the sort of the full disclosure wars and sort of say, yeah, that worked, or maybe we should have gone in a different direction?
Well, it created an industry that really wasn't there before, if nothing else than the selling of exploits to certain organizations. But I think, and Marcus Raynham will always argue the opposite, and this was in something recently, that we did make a big difference. If you look at Microsoft and their response, we helped them out tremendously by rattling their cage, kicking the hornet's nest, as it were. Intel, as Silicosis was just mentioning, they didn't have a security responder until we came up with their crypto box, the vulnerabilities in that. People started realizing that if they weren't going to be responsive to the to problems that we were bringing up, we'd take it public and we'd drag them through the muck. And large organizations that are dependent upon their share values didn't want this to happen. That changed pretty quickly as people realized, because we got a lot of notoriety and publicity off of a lot of the vulnerabilities that I and others published. And I think a lot of other people who got into the field did it for self-serving, trying to boost their own reputation, their ego. Ours was really, look, these vendors are not listening. The only thing we can do is publicly flog them until they respond. And now the vendors do respond, and people are still trying to publicly flog them. It's like, no, we have to, step up to the next level to try and help elevate.
I think some people kind of misunderstood, the goal of vulnerability research. It's not like we're going to find all the vulnerabilities in the product and tell the vendor. It's just like we're going to point out the most egregious ones, and the vendor's going to have to then go in and change the way they build software. So, you can't have an external QA process. You actually have to build the software the correct way. And all we were doing is pointing out that they weren't doing it. Vulnerability research itself isn't the solution. The vendors had to respond, and the vendors that have, do have substantially better code. Yeah. But the way I look at it is, people only start writing better code once they get picked on, and they start getting picked on once they get enough market share. So all the things with small market share, no one is picking on it. All that stuff is actually very, very fragile and has a lot of vulnerabilities in it. As it starts to get market share, it gets picked on, and then they say, hey, wait a minute. So there's like a long cycle when a company comes to market. There'll be like 3 or 4 years of revisions as they grow, and all of a sudden they get picked on, and then they start writing secure code. So because the way the market is like that, and half the software is written by companies that are probably, a few hundred employees, we have a lot of vulnerabilities still out there, even with Microsoft and Oracle and Apple doing a good job.
I want to add one thing in there that I agree with what Weld said. One thing that's still disturbing is that when people point out a particular vulnerability, let's say it's a buffer overflow, let's just say it's a stack overflow in a particular line of code, that the vendors oftentimes, not always, but still oftentimes will just go and fix that one particular problem. And what you're really trying to point out is you are making this particular type of mistake. You need to go back and fix all of those areas, and instead they just say, oh, this is what you found, we will fix that, rather than learning from it and actually saying, oh, any place where we have an unbounded copy, we should bound this copy to prevent overflows. And that's disturbing.
There's a big cost, though, to going through a product. There's something as large as, a Microsoft operating system or an Oracle application and finding everything that's in there. I mean, that's not trivial.
It's a big cost for that company, and I'll argue that it's a bigger cost for the person who gets popped by it if it's a real targeted, nasty attack.
All right. So is there, and speaking, I wanted to go back to, you were talking about smaller companies and the fact there's still a lot of vulnerabilities out there. We saw several bug-a-day kind of episodes, sort of like, pick your month, we'll have a different thing, and, Apple got picked on, a couple other companies got picked on. Is there still really a role for that? Is that the kind of thing that needs to happen for those companies as well? Or, as some people said at the time, was it really just kind of grandstanding on the part of the people who are doing it?
Well, I think that the bug a day, a little bit of it is trying to, focus your energy in one time, and it's a little bit of a marketing spin. I think, I'm not sure that they really make any more of a difference to do that. I mean, it probably gets it in the press more, which gets their customers to know about it a little bit more. But I haven't seen anyone who's been hit with a bug a day for a month actually change that much.
Mm-hmm. But it took a long time for Microsoft to change. I mean, you guys you and others pounded on them for a long time before they finally said, we're going to spend $1 billion and fix this.
Bill, when did you first
the Tower of Windows overflows?
Send the IE overflow to the first IE overflow was when?
Yeah, the
Internet
Explorer 4.0 had a overflow that I did a while back, was the res overflow. I did a stack one, I did a heap one with the MK overflow. Those two came out within like a month or so of each other, and it was like 1997.
And then Bill Gates came out with his memo in 2002.
Yeah.
So it took a lot of stuff to build up to get to the point where they would actually make the investment.
Well, you also remember what their first response was when, I took some of Hobbit's work on what eventually became part of L0pht Crack, and their first response was to try and take us out to dinner and then offer us their source code under non-disclosure agreements, which would then stop us from being able to publish any more vulnerabilities that we found.
We told them we already had it.
How was the dinner?
That was good.
So kind of segueing from that, though, there was the motive issue. There's a lot of controversy from certain people who are really looking to get paid for finding vulnerabilities. What's your take on whether, is that valid? Should people be paid for finding vulnerabilities?
Well, there's a few ways of looking at that. I mean, clearly, you've got the standard consulting model, where people are paid to find vulnerabilities for a particular company and not tell anyone except that company. But then you've got the markets that have grown up around vulnerabilities, and some of them are more legitimate than others. But the thing that I've noticed, I guess, is that there's a price now for a particular vulnerability or its type. And back in the day, you were just kind of finding vulnerabilities, and it was sort of of infinitesimal or infinite value, depending on the way you looked at it. Nowadays, a particular overflow on a particular platform is $70,000, and that generally would suggest that someone else is making a penny too somewhere off those vulnerabilities. So I have to ask the question: does a vulnerability sharing market result in crime or not?
Well, as we were mentioning when we talked right before the paneling, people should be paid for their research. And this is cognitive dissonance for me because I'm of the mindset that you should be sharing all the nasty, dangerous details of it, even if there's not a fix. Because if people are at least aware of it, they can potentially mitigate the effectiveness of the attack, even if there's not a defense against that particular attack, by moving resources, changing network ACLs, et cetera. And I'm saying this, of course, and my biggest clients are the intelligence community and the DoD now. So I'm in a bit of a quandary because
Do they share all the vulnerabilities they know?
I don't share shit anymore. But that's an interesting tact. I mean, the reason they don't share a lot of the stuff is a lot of the stuff's offensive in nature, and a lot of the stuff is defensive as well. And you don't want other people to know about the total capabilities that you have. And when you see the commercial sector go the same way,